Thank you, everybody who is already joined and who are joining. Welcome to session 3 of You Can Sit With Us with the amazing Dr. Sujitha. Is that how you would like me to refer to you at all times? If you do,
no, you do not need. I can confirm you do not need to refer to me as doctor.
Why not? Some people do want that, you know. And we have Rosa as well from Race and Health. And today's session is going to be all about, you guessed it, race and health and how those two are related. And if you would have read my kind of description for today's session, Race and Health is an organization that exists out of a lot of brilliant people who are just fun, regular, normal people like yourself and like we have the same interests, we live similar parallel lives, but except they spend a lot of their time, and some of them even like their full-time lives, their careers, to all different types of work within the community, whether that is healthcare, whether that's education, whether that's grassroots stuff, activism, you name it, they all inhabit different lanes. And what we're going to discuss today is how race impacts health and healthcare and how we could potentially get to more equality within this subject. And for those who have joined us for the first time, You Can Sit With Us, our weekly webinars with brilliant people that I feel like deserve a platform, with people who are more in my side of the industry, which is the creative part, the music part, and to give you a little bit of information to form opinions and make decisions on your own. I think we live in a time where there's a lot of access to information, and not always through the right sources or trustworthy sources, or sources who actually dedicate their time in their life to what they are speaking about and on. And sometimes it's just better to hear it from people who actually know what they're talking about. But what we're doing is we're not telling you what to do, we're giving you information, and you can then decide on where to research further, how to feel about it, and how to form your own opinions. So I'm going to give the floor to Rosa and Sujitha. I'm going to actually continue letting people in every now and then. I'll interject with a question if I feel like I personally don't understand something, or when I think that they're using a term that most of us wouldn't understand. And somewhere midway through, I'll do a little reintroduction of what's going on for people who have joined later on in the session. So take it away.
Thank you. My name's Sujitha. I am one of the founders of Race and Health. I'm a medical doctor, I'm an academic, I'm an activist. And I guess we're here today to talk to you as members of Race and Health, but also because I think Rosa's a particularly interesting person for me to talk to about this, because we've been friends since we were 16. So many of our formative years and experiences that we've gone through reflecting on our identity and how we maneuver certain spaces, whether that's school, education, work, boys, WhatsApp chats, all of this has been with each other as well as the rest of the world. So that's kind of the narrative that we're bringing to this today.
My name's Rosa. We won't be talking about any boyfriends, sadly, in this talk, but we will be talking about race and health. And so as you've heard, Jyoty is a medical doctor, and I guess in the context of this, I'll characterize myself as a patient of medical doctors. And one of the reasons we really want to do this is because we think in order to talk about the healthcare system, and to talk about the healthcare system, about how it works, you really need like both kind of perspectives. That's what we're kind of trying to bring together today, and that's what we try to bring together in Race and Health. We're a collective of medics, of academics, of artists, of which I'm an artist, that's my day job, of patients, of therapists, and maybe even yourselves by the end of the talk.
I think an important question to start with is, why are we talking about this? Why are we working on this? Why have we decided it's important to set up an organisation that basically addresses this? And I think we can only look to statistics for this. So if you're a black woman in the UK and you go to have a baby, you are 4 times more likely to die giving childbirth than your white counterpart. If you're South Asian and you're in the UK, the risk of you getting type 2 diabetes is 6 times that of your white counterpart. And if you're black, it's 3 times that. If you're a black man, then your risk of getting prostate cancer is double. There's loads and loads of these statistics, and I could go on for a while. But I think when it comes to COVID, for example, for us, I mean, I wasn't surprised, because if you look at all the disparities in health, it's not that surprising that black people are 4 times more likely to die because of this disease when compared to white people. So I think the reason why we're talking about this is there's so much inequality in health, and so much of that is racial inequality. And I think that's what we are trying to address.
Yeah, like for me, this was really highlighted, you know, what that moment we had in the UK a couple of weeks ago, where we had all of the pandemic and the Public Health England report being released, which had a lot of these statistics in them about how black and brown people are disproportionately affected by COVID and disproportionately more likely to die than their white counterparts. And then we also had the Black Lives Matter protests, which kind of kicked off in the wake of the death of George Floyd in America. And for me, I just started to think about, like, how do we think about Black Lives Matter in this country? Because we do have police brutality, which is a health risk for black people, but we also have COVID, which is this health risk for black people. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, you can look at this like whole spectrum in which black people's health is affected by physical violence, and also by, like, I don't know, maybe even like medical negligence, or like a lack of care from the government as to black people's healthcare.
Yeah, and I think in relation to Black Lives Matter, I think most people will have seen, you know, they'll look to the video that's the brutal killing of George Floyd, and I think most people will say that's outrageous, I can't believe that's happened. But what some people, I think what we're trying to say is that's directly linked to why black people are more likely to die from COVID in the UK. It's very easy to see something as a problem over there without realizing it's a problem over here. In fact, it's a problem everywhere. And what we're looking at Race and Health is that discrimination based on race, on skin color, on religion, caste, indigenous status, migratory status, even though on the surface level might look like different things, it all operates within systems of power and privilege that are afforded to some people and then not to others. And the way that they impact health, there's actually a lot of similarities across that. And I think it's important, particularly with these statistics, to think of them as a reflection of the state of things as they are now, not a fact that that's how it has to be, if that makes sense. Because some of the narrative about these statistics or these health problems that black and brown people have, people almost stop there, like it's an inevitability that because you're black and brown, you're more likely to die, and that's okay. I think we need to look beyond that and try and understand why that is, and basically just refuse to accept that.
Yeah, so I think so in this way, we've been really looking at racism as a public health crisis. But, you know, that said, race isn't actually, so race affects our health in all of these ways, as you've listed, Sujitha, but race isn't actually biological. It's not actually like written anywhere in our DNA, like, is it? It's,
no,
you know.
There's no such thing as like a black gene or a white gene. And if you think about how race was actually constructed, it was made up by people that were trying to categorize other people. And there's no genetic or biological basis to race. So when we're looking at why some people are dying from certain diseases, why are we then looking at genetic reasons if we know that that doesn't exist?
Yeah, and so, you know, like, even when, and the thing is that medicine and the way in which we talk about race are like really, really closely linked. Like back way, I'm gonna just say back in the day,
yeah.
Maybe you can correct me on the exact century,
yeah.
But when science and like the Enlightenment first began, one of the ways in which colonialism worked, like one of the ways in which the British Empire started to subjugate people in other countries, was to mark them as different to us. So race was something that was, the idea of race was a concept that was created in order to make people seem different from us. Therefore, it would be okay to discriminate against them, to subjugate them, to be violent towards them, and basically to not care about their health. And, you know, like, healthcare and the healthcare system is something that is affected by this attitude, this historical attitude towards other people. But actually, our health system, the health system and the science that like informs our health system, that was actually historically directly involved in the creation of these categories. So you see like scientists, you know, throughout the centuries, constantly worrying about how to categorize different people. There are a whole host of offensive names in which they used to use to categorize people of different races. And it's actually only relatively recently that the racial categories that we know now and kind of take for granted have been settled on. And even those categories will shift from country to country, even in the present day. So, you know, we're all in the UK, we're very familiar perhaps with like the forms that you will tick to say your like ethnicity or your race, which might be, you know, Black, Asian, mixed, Caucasian, etc. But I think you were saying earlier in Brazil, is it, Sujitha? They have completely different racial categories that they would tick.
Yeah. I mean, the way that we categorize people basically varies country to country, not just country to country. The category that you belong to depends on your context and your time. Like if you look back in different, like say 100 years ago, the racial category that I belong to would be completely different. I could be categorized as Caucasian in some category. So it's no fixed thing. But that's not to say that the impacts of the categorizations and actually creating the racial categories isn't real. And I think it's quite an unsettling, disturbing past that race or racism has with science, academia, with health. Because like you were saying, Rosa, we look to like science as like facts, objective truths. But science doesn't exist in a vacuum without the rest of the world. If you're living in a time where there are certain thoughts and belief systems that prevail, then those are scientists that are creating those statistics with those beliefs. So we like with the Holocaust, for example, there were so many scientists and doctors who were legitimizing those beliefs with eugenics, for example. When you look to, this is the example that I usually go to, and it's not one.
Really quickly there, you mentioned eugenics. Could you explain?
Yeah, so eugenics was kind of the belief that played out in science that there are different racial categories, but assigned to those racial categories are superiority and inferiority. So some are the most worthy and they should continue breeding, for example, and others are less worthy. And this played out in so many different ways. People were trying to attribute intelligence to the size of people's heads, to reasons as to why some countries are less developed than others. That's a very...
Criminality.
Yeah, and it's also really important to say that like sometimes we think of these as historic things that don't play out now. But I mean, there was a eugenics conference held in London at a university, I think 1 to 2 years ago. So it's not like it happened 100 years ago and it's not happening now. I was saying to you earlier, Jyoty, that if you've ever had a smear test, then one of the instruments that you use for that is called the SIMS speculum. The speculum is the name of the actual piece of equipment. And SIMS is the name of a gynecologist. So he was a doctor who did so many experiments on Black women without giving them pain relief or anesthesia, because they believed that Black women don't feel pain, and they felt that they're able to treat other humans like that. And so when we look at now, when there's evidence saying that Black women don't feel like they're believed when they're telling us in pain, well, that's because you've got a history of treating people like that. Yeah, so, and it's not like we were saying, like with COVID, there were scientists who were trying to say we should try out this vaccine in Africa. It's obviously still playing out today.
Can I ask another question? I thought it was really interesting when you both mentioned, Rosa and Sujitha, that there's categories, to indicate ethnicity or race, and these are different all across around the world. But how does this then impact medical school? Because that's, I'm literally just as a patient, like for example, I'm type 1 diabetic. And when I first started seeing my doctor, I was 4.5 when I was diagnosed. And the first question is, Indian, is there history in your family? Because diabetes occurs a lot amongst people of like Arab, Asian, African descent, West Indies. And, for me, now after hearing what you're saying, I'm thinking, okay, is that through experience, or is this something that is actually taught in medical school? Like, how is the science of medicine actually then passed on to doctors in relationship to what we consider to be race?
Yeah, great question. I think Rosa's heard me complain about this quite a lot as well.
I love to hear you complain about it. It's my favorite thing.
I think one of the ways that we're taught about race in medical school is, again, like an objective fact. So we're always taught that a risk factor for a certain disease is being black or being brown, but never any sort of exploration as to why that is. So when you're like training at medical school to be a doctor, you have to do these exams where it's basically like acting. So someone will come in as like a pretend actor and they're the patient, and then you have to ask them questions about why they're sick. And one of the things that we had at my medical school was we had, so when everyone does the exam, everyone has to do it at all different hospitals across this at the same time. So you can't cheat and talk to each other, for example, right? So we had our exam, and then afterwards, it was the last exam, everyone was talking about it. And then the thing that we realized everyone had missed is what we had to do is basically talk to this guy who'd come in and ask him a few questions, and we'll try to figure out one of the things you have to do is figure out how his kidneys are functioning. What our medical school did was that they hired like 7 black actors, for example, at each hospital. And what we were supposed to do is realize that because they're black, their kidney function is affected by it. Loads of us didn't do this. And I remember beating myself up being like, I remember that thing that we're taught, if you're black, then that affects how your kidneys work. And I just didn't do that. I learned like a couple of years ago that the science that's behind that isn't even rigorous, doesn't even make sense. But we're literally taught that to this day. And we're taught that as like facts. And also what's important is that like, I think you can be someone who is quite open-minded, but you're not realizing that every day when you go to work, you're like furthering these practices that are discriminatory. So if you're a black person in the UK and you've got high blood pressure, you get actual like different treatment, you get a different medication. That's like the national guideline all across the UK. So it's not even like someone's deciding to do that. And the evidence base for that is also not, it's like they only did studies based on black people. And what we're trying to say is that like, if my neighbor, so say I've got a neighbor and they're white, I'm likely to have just as much, like genetically, I might have more genetically in common with them than I might have with somebody else whose family is from Sri Lanka, for example, which is where my family is from. And that there's actually so much more differences between groups and within groups than we realize, but then that plays out with how we're giving people different treatment. So we're basically we're not taught about it, and we're taught about it in a way that's actually harmful. And because we're taught about it as facts, and there's so many facts to memorize, there's not even that much critical thinking and like questioning it. But having said that, there's a University of Washington, they had a group of black activists, they campaigned and they've removed categorizing race when you're calculating kidney function. So things are changing. We're working on that as well. We're trying to develop a curriculum within race and health that you can teach at medical school to kind of stop this happening, and also teaching the history of how we learn things, because if you don't understand the history, then you don't realize that what you think is a fact probably isn't.
Yeah, I think that I was really, really shocked to hear that you didn't learn any like history and theory in medicine. Like I know you've got to learn a lot of stuff, but I don't want to add extra work to your really busy life. But yeah, like if you knew the history of, for example, someone like Marion Sims, a very respected gynecologist who you know, effectively like tortured Black women in order to get the data which we still use today, like you would think twice about, you know, the research that other people have been conducting, and, you know, like, yeah, the other racial biases and the other things you're taught about race in medicine. You know, like it's through this history that we can, it's through learning about these history and having these kind of conversations that we think twice about the things that we're taking given. Like, think twice about that thing that you hear about, you know, yeah, like about diabetes being very common in certain communities, and those like links, such as hypertension, diabetes being more common in certain Black and brown communities, all of a sudden those things which you think about as fact and therefore as inevitable start to seem maybe less inevitable. Like, maybe there is something we can do about this to kind of stop these health issues being so common in these communities, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is actually really exciting. Like, there's this suddenly like this possibility that opens up. I also found it really interesting to hear this other statistic about the link to the to Marion Sims's research on Black women, experiments on Black women, which is that today Black people are less likely to be perceived as in pain than their white counterparts. And this is like something that we still, you know, that they did experiments where, like, I think it was it a needle that was they showed hands of different races and like a needle going towards the hands, and people who were observing the experiment had to say when they thought that the person was in pain and when they weren't in pain. And when it was a white hand, people perceived the person to be in pain much faster than when it was a Black hand. And this was the case even for Black people who were observing in the experiment. That it was even difficult for Black people to perceive pain in other Black people. And I think, you know, that just like really strikes me, because I think I can relate it back to, you know, experiences myself of going to the doctor and trying to persuade them as a Black woman that I'm in pain, and them, you know, like kind of writing you off, which I think is like such a common experience. And for many people who are, you know, marginalized in many different ways, like how do you make someone believe that you're in pain? And then also, you know, to link it back to Black Lives Matter, I just think of those, you know, of George Floyd, you know, pleading with the police that he can't breathe, and them not letting up, either for lack of wanting, like not caring that he couldn't breathe, but I also think probably because they also didn't believe that he couldn't breathe. They probably thought that he could take a certain amount of violence, which is, I think, is tied into some of these like news articles and cases we hear of, like, you know, I heard there was one that was like really early on about a Black woman who called up 111, said that she couldn't breathe, that she had COVID, and they didn't send an ambulance until it was too late. And so that is, you know, yeah, you kind of see that.
That's really interesting. That example that you used about the person who was Black and called up for an ambulance. I think they were told, we're only taking in people if they're like seriously can't breathe. Just wait till if your lips turn blue or something, then you need to call the ambulance. If you're Black and you're brown, your lips don't turn blue. And there are so many signs that we're taught in medicine that are basically only on white people's skin that I can't tell you that I can say for certainty what that would look like if that was me or like you. I don't know, because we're not taught that. What you're saying about how there are differences in how people are perceived. I mean, these beliefs they've been like deeply built into our society for hundreds of years. So it makes sense. Well, not that it makes sense, but I can understand why so many of us, even if we belong to the marginalized communities, internalize those beliefs. It's not like a conscious active thinking of it. One of the studies I was looking at was showing that Black men in the UK actually sometimes get higher doses when they've got mental health problems of antipsychotics, not because they need it, but because they're deemed to be stronger, so they need like a stronger medication, which is basically what you were saying, Rosa, this perception of being really strong or can withhold like more pain. Yeah, it's interesting how that plays out today. I guess what we're saying in terms of what you felt quite hopeful about, Rosa, is that, so we know that there are racial inequalities in health. We also know that there's no genetic or biological basis to race. So I guess what we're focusing on is what is actually causing some communities to become sick and to die earlier. And I think what we have to talk about is that what we call in public health, the socio-economic determinants of health, which basically means where you live, how you live, what you do day to day affects your health. And when you say it like that, it makes a lot of sense. But when you try and implement change to address that, it's not as easy. It's not as easy to do.
How do you come into like the doctor's room and they're like, "What's wrong?" And you're like, "Well, I was born 7 years ago, and then my house was really small, and I found it difficult to access information about what was going on in my body because I was born black." Like it's really a really long story. So I guess it's more like socioeconomic factors. They're not as snappy. They're not as headline grabbing. They're not as, I don't know, maybe they're not as easy to explain. But I think for all of us who who live lives, I think that if you reflect, you do see the way that you live your life really affects your health and your healthcare outcomes.
I think just for people who are hearing what the examples you guys are giving right now, just quickly to add on to that, if you're interested in learning more, just because this reminded me of something, when I did my master's, I came to London and I studied world history and cultures, and there was quite a few people in my year who did some interesting dissertations on actually a similar topic, which is how a lot of this being perceived to be stronger and less likely to experience pain is traced back to how slaves were picked. And this is, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, if it's called epigenetics, but it's basically how trauma and certain beliefs and physical pain can be passed on through generations. So there's so many interesting studies on that, and you should definitely check that. The same, for Black people, it traces back to slavery and how slaves were picked based on like the strongest, or even strongest, not necessarily the most muscle mass, but even like more bones, less meat, less likely, longer to work in the heat and be able to drag things for longer. And even with the British Army under the Queen's rule, the Sikh people were seen as the warrior race. So they recruited a lot of Sikh Punjabi men and even women into the British Army because they were considered to be stronger fighters. And I think it's mind-blowing, even just to read up about this stuff and how this has trickled down through generations, and how literally, like you said, how we even perceive our own kind, whatever that may mean, or whatever you want to define that as to be stronger or less likely to feel pain. And you almost, when you think about it this way, you start feeling guilty. You think, but why would I think that my skin, or the darker skin than mine, wouldn't feel the same pain or even more pain? Like it can't be just by the color or the race or the ethnicity. So yeah, I think suggesting for people who want to know more about this, look it up. I don't know if is it called epigenetics?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned that. So we're writing the academic papers as well. So the paper that I'm writing at the moment is one of the sections that we're focusing on is epigenetics, slightly different to what you're talking about. But what epigenetics kind of is, it's different from genetics in that we've all got DNA, or we've got a genetic code, which epigenetics, what we're focusing on is how your exposure to stresses, so whether that's exposure to discrimination, being unemployed for so long, being excluded from school, in facing the criminal justice system, how long-term chronic exposure to stress and discrimination actually causes certain genes, etc., to be expressed. That means that you're more likely to get diseases like high blood pressure and diabetes. So rather than thinking it's just an inevitability, you're going to get, the reason why you're getting high blood pressure is because you're Black. It's more actually looking at how stresses and discrimination that you face because of your skin color, rather than the skin color itself causing those diseases. So yeah, that's what we're looking at in terms of epigenetics. with our research at the moment.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because I'm learning whilst working on it at the same time. And again, like you're saying, challenging so many of the beliefs that we internalize ourselves.
Yeah, because even also that's also like the stuff that you're talking about, Jyoty, like it also like is passed down through like media and the language we use. Like we've all heard of like the phrase like the strong black woman, which I think is often meant as a compliment, but actually perhaps stops us from recognizing when black women are in need of care, like, or in need of help, or in need of a listening ear, or any, you know, it's these stereotypes, like the same way that we often, like, as I'm a performance artist and I'm very interested in the history of how black people have been portrayed as performers, especially like sports performers. You see like black people, you know, at the Olympics, that's kind of the time we see most black people on TV, is when we see them like making these amazing physical feats, and you think of them as like, wow, they must be so healthy, they're at the top of their game. Like these are the very common representations of black people that we see. And I think that we can see the link between the portrayal of black people as these kind of like amazing physical, I hate to say it, like specimens, quote unquote, and the way that we saw the way that colonialists saw black people as slaves, as, again, specimens. And I think it's like, whether it's kind of meant in a kind of more positive light, as we think of like when we talk about like amazing black athletes, or like a negative light when we talk about black slaves, like it all exists on a spectrum which basically works to dehumanize black people and dehumanize brown people. And that's where it becomes an issue, because then we're not thinking about their care and what they need. So to bring it back to, like, I guess, the socio-economic factors, you've got the media, you've got like generational trauma, you've got the ways in which you're seen by the healthcare system. You've also got things like how, you know, your housing that you live in will affect your health. And so there we can see, for example, you know, a recent example in the Grenfell fire tragedy, you saw that because of the place in which people lived, because of the way in which that building was built, literally, the cladding that was clad in that building, the way it was organized in terms of fire escapes, etc., the way that the amount of people that were put in that building meant that they were actually in greater proximity to death. So it meant that they had, and those people were majority black and brown, they had a lower life expectancy because of the environment that they were in. And that is a socio-economic factor, like affecting your health. And I think it's just one way that you can see how your physical health could be affected by the environment in which you're in a really tragic way.
Yeah, I know we were talking about that as an example earlier, and I remember when I was watching that, as you do with any sort of tragedy, everyone can remember where they were or what was happening or what you were doing at the time. It was a very surreal moment for me. I was working at the World Health Organization in Geneva in the department that works on public health and the social determinants of health. And like, here we are, you know, working on research, trying to get policy changes happening, ministers of health. And then you see that happen. And I just remember weeping, feeling like, I don't know, this kind of disconnect between, I mean, I fully understand why this is happening, but that kind of helpless feeling about it. And I mean, it's not just, I mean, we can think about it like Grenfell, but COVID is just like another example, right? And this whole thing about the virus not discriminating, the virus doesn't, but systems that we live in and the way that we live does. So just to explain, like, the evidence says that basically in the UK, if you're black and brown, you're more likely to get COVID, and you're also more likely to be more sick when you've got it. So if you look at why you're more likely to get it, that's because we're in more public facing jobs, whether that's like delivering your parcels, working in the NHS, working in shops. And it's the fact that you're firstly more likely to be in that environment. But also, when you're in that environment, are you able to advocate for your health? So, like, are you able to ask for PPE? Because this is the thing that I found, again, doing all this work on racism, but when it was happening to me personally, I couldn't actually make the link. So I was working in an A&E department and there wasn't enough PPE. I used one mask.
Sorry, PPE, for those who don't know, if there's someone not from the UK, maybe.
Of course, sorry. Protective personal equipment, which basically means like gloves, mask, shield, all the things that would hopefully put a barrier between me and droplets of coronavirus. And I had to use the same mask for 5 night shifts, which is outrageous. And like we would ask and I wouldn't get it, or there wasn't anything. And then it was, and I just thought, oh, maybe that's just how it is. But like, that was a problem that was happening everywhere. Like, we had questions for our webinar, people were submitting questions. The question that kept coming up from like Black and brown doctors and nurses, where they were like, can you help? How can I ask for PPE without being called aggressive or pushy or troublesome? And then made me realize that it wasn't just me, this was like a broader problem of that. The Royal College of Nursing did a survey and there were more Black nurses that felt they didn't have the adequate equipment compared to white nurses. And then on the second thing that we were talking about is that you're more likely to be more unwell when you present. There's loads of reasons why that could be as well. So one of the things is, if you are, for example, a migrant or you're undocumented in this country, then you don't want to have to pay charges if you don't, like, you might not be able to afford those charges. You might actually think that you are going to be, people are going to talk to the Home Office. You might, like, your entire, like, you're concerned about so much more than just your health right now. So people wait as long as they can before they have to go in, and when they do, they become really sick. Then there's other things like you having other health conditions like high blood pressure or diabetes that means that when you get it, you're more likely to be more sick with it. And we've already said that racism and, you know, discrimination has a role to play in those diseases. So it's just, there's examples of it everywhere. And I think COVID's quite an easy one because it's weirdly one of the things that the whole world has tuned into at the same time. I guess what I think is quite helpful is to talk about what we can do, because I mean, and this is also where I think my focus lies now, because I think I feel I know what's, to some extent, I know some things that are going on. I think we should both, like, I can't say I know exactly why everything is happening, but we have an understanding of a lot of the main mechanisms. And actually, Rosa, we were having a chat about how we can learn about certain movements in history and where certain moments of change have come. I don't know if anyone's seen this. I was watching Hollywood on Netflix, right? And the first episode, I was like, okay, don't really care or whatever. Later on, and there was that whole moment when there's this like a union because they've got this film that features Black actors written by a Black actor. And I was asked in my like group chat, I was like, how can we create that kind of feeling or movement for change right now? And then I feel like a month later, I feel like that's where we're in right now. I don't know, I feel like things are changing.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I feel like already since we started to have these conversations, since we first started to have these conversations about, you know, racism and how it affects healthcare, like, I personally have been able to like realize more what I need. Like, I realized that I'm in pain. I realized that the reasons might be because of like particular instances of racial trauma that I have, and you know, like me as someone with some like mental health issues, I've been able to, you know, that there's been so much stuff that's come up around free therapy for Black people, or which removes one barrier. Also, you know, Black therapists who particularly like specifically specialize in racial trauma, or even know that like race is going to be a factor in how it affects your mental health, advertising their services and like people sharing that information. So I feel like without this kind of conversation, perhaps I wouldn't really have realized that that might be something that I need. But that's like, so for me personally, like, I think that it's, you know, like having this conversation has been useful for my health. And to look historically, like you were saying, I wanted to talk about like a different moment in time, a different pandemic that was also disproportionately affecting marginalized people. And that's the AIDS pandemic that happened in the 80s and 90s. So at that time, people, when people first started dying of AIDS, and this overwhelmingly affected the LGBTQ population, people didn't know what it was, people didn't know what the disease was, people didn't know how to name it, people didn't know how to treat it. And and people couldn't get access to healthcare for a variety of reasons that are very similar actually to the reasons that we're talking about now. Lack of access in terms of financial access, lack of access in terms of like knowing how to advocate for yourself to a doctor, and also discrimination. In the case of people suffering from AIDS, it was often homophobia, but also often racism if those people were Black or brown. So ACT UP, and you should look this up, ACT UP, they're a great organisation that was an activist group that was started up during this period. And they're a group of activists, many of whom were suffering from AIDS themselves, and also, and also medical professionals who were allies, who were like, very, very few at that time. But they campaigned to basically raise public awareness of the fact that people were dying in such great numbers, but also to say that this was something that scientists needed to start looking into, that it was important, and it was important to everyone that a cure, or as close as possible to a cure, was found. And this is at a time when the people who were dying, the people who were dying from AIDS were rendered completely invisible. So they were, the way that the media spoke about them, we talked before about how the media shapes your understanding of which people need healthcare, which people are meant to die, which people aren't, which people is it acceptable to die, whose lives matter and whose lives don't. And at the time, the mainstream media was circulating around the fact that these people were gay, and that because of that, it was kind of okay, it was kind of accepted that they would maybe die because of that quote unquote lifestyle, which is obviously like incredibly horrible. So part of the strategy of ACT UP, this activist organisation, was to make those lives, the lives of the LGBT community, and the lives and also the deaths of the LGBT community, visible in mainstream life. So they did a lot of really like amazing and creative and visually and symbolically extremely powerful, what you call direct actions, which is like, doing a kind of action, a display, a protest really in the public eye. So for example, they did things where they took where they did a die-in on Wall Street, and you might have seen like examples of a die-in where like people kind of like lie on the floor as if they're dead, but it's quite powerful because it really takes up a lot of space in the city. Like it can block traffic, it stops people from like going about their daily lives. So that's one way that they entered into spaces where people would just be going out their jobs and trying to get on with their lives and like not think about the pandemic, and they would be there like, this is an issue, stop what you're doing. There's also like they also did some really powerful things, like they held public funerals, so taking out like not dying quietly, but instead taking their grief in the morning like really to the streets, which is again like so powerful. And you can look at like images and you can read up more about it. And then I just want to bring an example that really made me think about this and really made me feel like the parallels, was that I was watching Pose. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's it's on BBC iPlayer, 2 series, also on Netflix. And it's talking about the lives of Black trans people during the height of the AIDS pandemic. It's fictional, but it's like very closely linked to reality. And during it, 2 of the main characters, Praytel and Blanca, and then subsequently their houses, they all become really, they're suffering from HIV and AIDS, and they become really involved in the ACT UP movement. And one of the things they do is they wrap Blanca they wrap one of their landlord's houses in like a giant inflatable condom, and it just makes this like amazing poetic link between the housing, like socio-economic factors, kind of like what we were talking before with Grenfell, and about how that affects your health, and a physical, like, and a like public health crisis, a biological public health crisis, which in that case was the AIDS pandemic. And so I think that when I look at the work of ACT UP, I just see how they're refusing to be made invisible. And I think that's just really powerful and amazing to see how scientists and patients and people who care for people are just collaborating in this really like multidisciplinary way that, you know, like the odds were so stacked against them at that time, and it's amazing to just see how they were able to change the narrative around HIV and AIDS, and we live with that legacy of those people's work today.
Yeah, it's something that we've spoken about a lot, and I dropped off a book to Rosa that basically talks about, I think it's called like How to Survive a Plague. It's like this big. You don't need to read the book. You can literally get there it is. But there's other ways to access that information, like watching Pose, for example. It doesn't all have to be academic. One of the media. Yeah, one of the things that's quite interesting about that, because that's basically why we created.
So we've got a little over 10, just to be the boring teacher in the room. Sorry, continue.
What was I saying? We're actually quite good for time based on our schedule, I think. So I feel good. What was I saying? We've been talking about how do you basically create change on such a mass scale, because Race and Health actually start initially as a group of just academics. But one discipline alone is never going to change the world. And ACT UP is a really good example of that, to kind of look at how, so one of their slogans, which lots of people have been using their graphics and their posters right now in the last few weeks, because the sentiment is exactly the same. So they had a poster that was silence equals death. And what we've, like you were saying, that kind of publicity stunt that they use with the condoms, for example, like in my professional role, when I go to work as a doctor or I'm working with other public health academics, I can't pull those stunts because I have to be professional or I have to behave a certain way. But other activists or other artists can work together. So I can maybe talk about the evidence in that space, and artists can kind of bring what we were talking about with Rosa, because Rosa's a performance artist, is what's the role of an artist, and actually like bringing these issues into public consciousness. And in terms of what people can do, I mean, we're not going to talk about what the government or states can do. This is just everyday people like you and me. What can we do is, and this is the thing that we've been doing basically our whole lives, is having conversations between disciplines, from people from doing like completely different things to you, but also amongst like different generations. I saw my nephews yesterday for the first time in like, I don't know, since this all started. And they're 9 and 6. And I was talking to them, and my nephew, who was like 6, was like, well, people of color are like angry because, and I was like, when I was 6, I didn't even have the words to even identify as a person of color or like what was going on. But at the same time, I've been having conversations with my mum about anti-Blackness in the South Asian community and how we should never use fair and lovely, for example, like, because I think that's where you get the real change, or the real ability to change opinions. It's great to talk to your friends who pretty much agree with you generally, but you're not really going to push opinion unless you talk to people across disciplines and across ages.
Yeah, on this point of being interdisciplinariness, like something really struck me that I'm not going to talk about my mum, but I'm going to talk about, you know, like my spiritual sister, who is Serena Williams, the great tennis player. And, you know, like obviously she's the greatest tennis player in the world, everyone knows that. But, you know, when she had her baby, she experienced like blood clots and she couldn't breathe, which is like such a harrowing phrase because it echoes all those other moments of Black Death. But she couldn't breathe, and she had to basically like convince the doctor while she couldn't breathe, that she couldn't breathe, and so that they would do a scan and give her oxygen, like even someone of her fame, of her money, but because she's a Black woman, like her pain isn't believed. But I bring this up not to repeat those points, but to say, like, then when she wrote about that experience that she had, I think it brought that health issue to a whole new audience of people, which I think is like really, really important work to be doing. Like, we need to reach outside and across our disciplines and think about what these different people can tell us about health, about how we and help us to live our lives in a different way. And I think that's also really like great thing about why I'm so like grateful that you've invited us to be on Rinse FM, because I think it's really important to break these things outside of academia and to talk about to make some of these statistics that we hear about in the news, to make them a little bit more complicated. Like, I mean that in terms of like to see them not just as facts, but to like not normalize them, like not normalize the fact that Black people are up to 4 times more likely to die of COVID. To actually think, hey, that's actually not a statistic that I think should be a fact, and that actually say, listen, there's something I can do about it. I'm realizing the socio-economic factors that contribute to that statistic, which allows me then to think, how can I campaign to make this no longer a reality? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's been like a really great, that's something that like I feel like I can do as an individual, is to talk about that statistic beyond just the facts, and to think about it as something that can be changed.
Yeah. And the first step is basically, I think, accepting that it's not okay. And I think everyone can work towards making it not okay in their own way. Yeah, it doesn't really matter who you are. There's basically no excuse for you to not get involved if you want to. And that's like Angela Davis was saying, this is like my recent go-to example, she's been doing this work before we were born. And a few weeks ago, she said she has never felt there be like such a global uprising against racism. If she feels like that, then literally none of us have any excuse not to be working on this. So I guess, I mean, in terms of like tangible things that we'd like you to do with race and health, we are in our global consultation phase, which basically means we want you to tell us what you want. So if you want podcasts, if you want webinars, if you want to work with us, but you don't know how, or you've got an idea, you literally just go to our website, raceandhealth.org, click on global consultation. It closes on July 11th. And we basically want to hear from everyone, but particularly the people that we don't usually hear from. And that's, like you were saying, Rose, that's why we're speaking with you today, which will be like shown on, played on Rinse FM. We've also got a resources page on there. So if you're looking for books for kids, or you want a podcast to listen to, that's there as well.
I'm just trying to, is it race and health spelled out?
Yeah, I'll put it on there. Do you want me to put it on the chat? Hold on.
Brilliant. .org. Amazing. And I think, you already said there's resources on the website. I think everything you've mentioned today, you know, we tried to keep it brief and up to 1 hour, but actually I was speaking to the girls earlier, and you've recently done a webinar where you had 2,000 people listening to what was going on. And I think it's the most important thing I want to happen out of today is that, like you said, interdisciplinary, it needs to go, the message needs to be spread across people beyond who we think or always were taught to believe are the ones to be discussing the subject, which is the doctors, which is the people with the higher education, the middle age, the middle class. And the truth is, we all go and see doctors. We all, you know, you use Serena Williams as a brilliant example, you know, just to things, take it back to topics that we can remember or have seen or read about. Even Diddy's Mrs. wife, when she passed away from pneumonia, you know, the first thing that was being said was she wasn't being taken seriously when she went to go and see the doctors. who has more money than that family? And look, it happens over and over again. This stuff goes beyond your status, your class. It's so deeply rooted in our society, and we have just been taught to not question it. And I think the most important thing from today is that I want people to start questioning things. You know, when you go and see a doctor and you've been told, no, you're fine, how do I then say, I don't think I'm fine, I would like to check with somebody else? Because that is an option you have. And, you know, I was talking to Rosa and Sujitha earlier, you know, to make it a little bit more personal, especially here in the UK with the NHS, which a lot of us are either so grateful for or, you know, we hate so much. We need to also think about how the NHS is presented to us and how we are made to believe that we are treated by the NHS. 2 summers ago, I was admitted here in my local hospital at Homerton for something that could have been avoided if I didn't have to wait for 4 hours in A&E, if I was just given my medication. But instead, I had to wait so long. My blood sugar skyrocketed. I had to go into A&E overnight, and then I was on a ward with 7 other people in one room. In August, the AC was broken, no pillow, my contacts were dried out. I had to take my contacts out. I'm -5, so I can't see anything. And there's all these different doctors coming to see me. There's nurses working 20-hour shifts who I can clearly see are losing it. I'm losing it. And during this horrible experience where I ended up leaving the hospital because I threatened to yank my IV out, I started to hate the NHS. And when I told my friend afterwards that that's how I was feeling, you know, he said, be careful, because this is what happens. This is the little seed that's now been planted in your head that maybe private healthcare is probably the way to go. And this is, again, so deeply rooted in politics, and we need to start questioning these things. Like, hey, is the NHS actually treating me bad, or is the NHS treated badly? And therefore, it trickles down into how I, as a patient, am treated. And I know I mentioned that earlier to you both, and you agreed. So I think, you know, from someone who isn't a doctor or who isn't an activist within race and health, but would like to get more involved,
I'm
trying to recruit you.
You need to help with the massive condom when you do that one.
All about massive condoms.
Massive over Parliament.
I'm so ready. And someone's asked, I think before we say goodbye, Nikita said, do you have a mini reference list of scientific literature to start with?
Yes, let me get you the link right now. Hold on. It's literally one I prepared earlier. Hold on.
Oh, brilliant. For the people who are going to hear this on the air tomorrow, where can they find this? It's
on the Race and Health website. So it's RACEANDHEALTH.org.
Brilliant.
And there's a section called resources, and under that there's loads of different subsections, and there's a bit that says academic articles and reports, and there's lots there. There's a page called The Lancet as well, which is a medical journal that all of our work is in. So all the work that we've written so far is on there as well.
Brilliant. For people who found this today very helpful, someone just said this has been one of the most educational hours of my life.
Oh, that's very nice.
Fill in the form and come join us.
I love that. Yeah. Everybody, let's go and follow Race and Health on Instagram. If you like today's session, tell everybody to tune into Rinse tomorrow, 4 to 5 p.m. So, you know, you can be working on your laptop, cleaning the house, going for a walk. Just go to rinse.fm. You can listen in from your smartphones, your laptop, whatever it is. I'm going to love you and leave you all. Sujitha and Rosa, thank you so much. Thank you so much. People are in the chat school saying thank you so much. So good.
Tell your granddad, tell your grandma.
A project addressing inequalities in maternity care, and this has been wonderful. There we go. Brilliant. Thank you both so much. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Hope to catch you again next Monday, and please do check out the audio that will go out tomorrow on Rinse if you missed any of today, 4 to 5 p.m. Thank you, Sujitha and Rosa, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
so much.
Bye.